Imagine being a German intelligence officer in June 1944. You look across the English Channel and see exactly what you expected. Thousands of American soldiers, columns of tanks, aircraft, landing craft, radio traffic filling the air. And behind all of it, one name that terrifies the German command: George S. Patton. You report it to Berlin. The Americans are coming. Patton is preparing an enormous army to invade France. But there is one problem. The army you're watching doesn't exist. And while German commanders stare at this phantom force near the Pas-de-Calais, the real American army is crossing the beaches of Normandy. This was not science fiction. It was one of the greatest military deceptions of the Second World War, and for weeks, Hitler's Germany would continue preparing for an invasion that had already happened somewhere else. Welcome to True War Stories. Because this is the story of the army Germany could see, but never find. In the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany knew the invasion was coming. There was no question about that. Britain had become a giant military staging ground. American troops were arriving in enormous numbers. Ships were gathering in British ports. Aircraft filled the skies. Supplies were being moved day and night. The Allies were preparing for something enormous. The question was not whether an invasion would happen. The question was, where? That question could determine the fate of Europe. And the Germans had a very logical answer: Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. It was geographically attractive. The English Channel was relatively narrow there. The region was close to major German communications routes, and German planners already expected the Allies to choose the shortest route across the Channel. The Germans had also built extensive defenses along the French coast. But there was another problem. The Allies knew exactly what the Germans were thinking, and they decided to use it against them. The operation would eventually become known as Fortitude South. Its purpose was simple to describe: make Germany believe the main Allied invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. But carrying it out would require something much more complicated. The Allies needed to create an entire army without actually creating an army. The centerpiece was the fictional 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, and the man placed at its head was perhaps the perfect choice: George S. Patton. Patton was not just another American general. To German commanders, he represented speed, aggression, and armored warfare. His reputation had been built in North Africa and Sicily. He was unpredictable. He was aggressive. And most importantly, the Germans believed he was capable of leading a devastating assault. So if the Allies wanted Germany to believe a massive army was waiting in southeastern England, putting Patton's name on it made the story believable. But there was a problem. Patton could not simply announce that he commanded an army. There had to be evidence. Real evidence. Something German intelligence could photograph. Something spies could report. Something radio operators could intercept. Something that looked convincing from hundreds of miles away. So the Allies built a phantom army. Across southeastern England, the fictional force began to take shape. The Germans were supposed to believe that enormous American formations were gathering there. And from the air, they needed to see something that looked like an invasion force. So the Allies created deception sites. There were fake tanks, fake vehicles, fake aircraft, fake landing craft. Some of the equipment was inflatable. Other objects were made from wood, canvas, and lightweight materials. From the ground, they could look ridiculous. From several thousand feet in the air, especially through the limitations of wartime reconnaissance photography, they could look surprisingly convincing. The objective wasn't to fool every German soldier. It was to create enough evidence to influence German intelligence analysts. A photograph of a fake tank alone meant almost nothing. But a photograph of fake tanks combined with radio transmissions, combined with reports from supposed agents, combined with the presence of Patton, could create an entirely different picture. And that was the genius of the operation. The Allies weren't creating one lie. They were creating an entire world of interconnected lies. One piece supported another, and the more pieces German intelligence collected, the more convincing the story became. But there was something even more powerful than fake tanks: radio. Real armies create enormous amounts of radio traffic. Orders, reports, logistics, movement, training, command messages. An army preparing for an invasion should sound busy. So the fictional FUSAG needed to sound busy too. Allied radio operators began transmitting carefully planned messages designed to imitate the communications of a huge military organization. The Germans were listening. And that was exactly what the Allies wanted. The transmissions helped German intelligence analysts estimate where units supposedly were. They helped create the impression that Patton's army was enormous. And because the radio signals were coming from areas where the Germans expected the invasion force to be located, the deception became even stronger. The Germans weren't simply being told that Patton was there. Their own intelligence systems appeared to be proving it. Then came perhaps the most dangerous part of the deception: the spies. British intelligence had spent years fighting German espionage inside Britain. Many German agents had been captured, neutralized, or turned into double agents. Some of these agents now became weapons of deception. They could send reports back to their German handlers, reports describing Allied formations, reports describing preparations, reports describing Patton's supposed army. The information was designed to match the other evidence. That mattered enormously. Because if German intelligence received the same story from multiple sources, the story became harder to dismiss. Imagine being a German analyst in 1944. You have aerial photographs, you have radio intercepts, you have intelligence reports, you have reports from agents, and they all appear to point toward the same conclusion. Patton is in southeastern England. He commands a massive army. And that army is preparing to cross the channel toward Pas-de-Calais. The evidence appears overwhelming, except almost all of it has been carefully constructed. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Before sunrise, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. Thousands of Allied ships and landing craft moved toward Normandy. American, British, and Canadian troops were heading toward the beaches. The real invasion was happening. But somewhere in German headquarters, another invasion was still being expected. The Phantom Army had done its job so well that the Germans remained convinced that Normandy might not be the main attack. That distinction was critical, because even after the Normandy landings began, German commanders had to make a decision. Was this the invasion, or was it a diversion? If the Allies had landed in Normandy with the intention of eventually attacking Pas-de-Calais, moving German reserves toward Normandy too early could leave Calais dangerously exposed. The Germans had to choose, and the deception made that choice incredibly difficult. This is where the Phantom Army became more than a clever trick. It became a strategic weapon. German forces in the Pas-de-Calais region included the powerful 15th Army, and that army mattered. If large German forces could be moved quickly into Normandy, the Allied beachhead could face a much more dangerous situation. But the German command continued to worry about the possibility of another major Allied landing. The Phantom Army was supposedly still waiting. Patton was supposedly still waiting. The real invasion had begun, but the Germans were still preparing for the imaginary one. That hesitation gave the Allies something priceless: time. And in warfare, time can be more valuable than tanks, more valuable than aircraft, more valuable than ammunition. Because every hour that German reinforcements remained away from Normandy gave Allied forces another hour to strengthen the beachhead. More men could land, more artillery could arrive, more supplies could be unloaded, more defensive positions could be established, and the invasion became harder and harder to destroy. The U.S. Army later noted that the deception helped keep German reinforcements tied down for weeks, while the real Third Army forces prepared to enter France. But perhaps the strangest part of the story is what happened after D-Day. You might assume that once the Germans discovered Allied troops were firmly established in Normandy, the deception was finished. It wasn't. The Allies kept the illusion alive. The Germans needed to believe that Patton's army was still capable of attacking Pas-de-Calais. And that meant continuing the deception even as the real Allied armies pushed deeper into France. This was extraordinarily important, because the Allies didn't just need to surprise Germany on June 6. They needed to prevent Germany from concentrating its forces effectively afterward. The deception had to survive contact with reality, and remarkably it did. German leadership continued to fear a second major landing. The Normandy invasion could therefore be interpreted as something smaller than the decisive blow. A diversion, a preliminary attack, a trap designed to pull German forces away from Calais. That belief bought the Allies more time. There was another brilliant psychological element, Patton himself. The Allies understood German thinking well enough to know that his reputation could become a weapon. German commanders respected him. They considered him one of America's most dangerous battlefield commanders. So his supposed presence made the Phantom Army believable. It was almost as if the Allies had taken Germany's fear of Patton and turned that fear against Germany. The Germans expected Patton to attack. So the Allies gave them Patton, just not the army they thought he commanded. And eventually, the real Patton arrived in France. But by then, the situation was changing rapidly. The American breakout from Normandy was beginning. Operation Cobra shattered open the German front. The newly activated 3rd U.S. Army, with Patton in command, moved rapidly through France. And now something almost poetic happened. The man who had once commanded Germany's imaginary army was suddenly commanding a very real one. Patton's Third Army became one of the fastest-moving Allied forces in Europe. The deception that had once placed his name beside a phantom army had helped protect the real invasion. And the Germans now had a completely different problem. They could no longer find the army they expected, because it was moving somewhere else. Still, it would be wrong to say that the fake army alone won D-Day. History is rarely that simple. The invasion succeeded because of enormous Allied advantages: air superiority, naval power, logistics, industrial production, airborne operations, intelligence, the courage of soldiers on the beaches, and the German command structure itself was deeply divided. The deception was one piece of a much larger machine, but it was an extremely important piece. The U.S. Army has emphasized that the Germans' belief in the threat to Pas-de-Calais created a dilemma that helped prevent the timely commitment of German armored reserves to Normandy, and that is what makes this story so fascinating. The Allies didn't defeat German defenses simply by attacking them. They manipulated German expectations. They made the enemy defend against something that wasn't there. And every German division watching the wrong coastline was a division that could not immediately crush the real invasion. Think about what that means. On June 6th, thousands of Allied troops were fighting for their lives in Normandy. Men were climbing cliffs, landing under machine gun fire, dragging wounded comrades through the surf, trying to establish a foothold against German resistance. For those soldiers, the battle was brutally real, but far away, another battle was happening inside German headquarters. A battle of information, a battle of assumptions, a battle over what German commanders believed was happening. And in that battle, the Allies had constructed an enemy that existed only in the German imagination. An army of tanks that were mostly inflatable. An army of aircraft that could not fly. An army of landing craft that could not carry soldiers. An army of radio operators whose greatest weapon was not ammunition, but deception. And at the center of it all stood George Patton, a real general, commanding a fake army, convincing Nazi Germany that the greatest blow was still coming, even after the real blow had already landed. The lesson of the Phantom Army is bigger than D-Day. Modern warfare is often described as a contest of weapons. Who has more tanks? Who has more aircraft? Who has more soldiers? But Fortitude South demonstrated something different. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the belief you create inside your enemy's mind. The Germans had guns, they had tanks, they had divisions, they had fortifications, but they also had uncertainty. And uncertainty can paralyze an army. The Allies understood that. So instead of simply hiding their real strength, they created a false strength. They gave Germany something to fear, something to watch, something to calculate, something to defend against. And while Germany watched the ghost, the real army landed. By July, the deception had served its greatest purpose. The Allies had survived the most dangerous opening phase of the invasion. Their forces were expanding. The breakout was approaching. And the German military was being forced to react to a war it increasingly could not control. The imaginary 1st U.S. Army Group would eventually disappear as the real armies took over its role. But its effect had already been felt. It had consumed German attention at exactly the moment when attention mattered most. And that may be the most extraordinary detail of all. The Allies didn't need Germany to believe the lie forever. They only needed Germany to believe it long enough for the first wave to land, long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough for the beachhead to become too strong to eliminate, long enough for the real army to break out. In war, deception doesn't have to last forever. It only has to last until it changes the outcome. And the Phantom Army did exactly that. So the next time you see an old photograph of George Patton standing beside his soldiers, remember something strange about his reputation in 1944. For a while, Germany was terrified of an army commanded by Patton. They searched for it. They analyzed it. They tracked its radio signals. They studied reports about it. They prepared defenses against it. And yet, when the moment came, they could never find it. Because there was nothing to find. The army existed on maps, in radio rooms, in intelligence reports, in photographs, and most importantly, inside the minds of German commanders. Meanwhile, the real American army was already fighting its way through Normandy. That was the trick. Germany wasn't defeated by an army it couldn't see. For a crucial period of the war, Germany was distracted by an army that wasn't there. This was Fortitude South. This was the Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group. And this was one of the greatest deceptions ever carried out in wartime. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to True War Stories for more forgotten operations, impossible missions, and the hidden moments of history that changed the course of war. Because sometimes, the most dangerous army is the one your enemy believes is coming.